I didn't say a word, not one, and that silence ended up saving everything I had left. My name is Robert. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Peterborough, Ontario for 31 years. The maple tree in the front yard was a sapling when my wife Margaret and I moved in. Now it's taller than the house. Margaret used to say that tree was proof that patience was always worth it. She passed away 2 years ago this coming March. Pancreatic cancer. We had 44 years together, and I still reach for her side of the bed some mornings before I remember. After she was gone, the house got very quiet. I'm a retired high school history teacher, 32 years at Crestwood Secondary. I coached the debate team for 20 of those years. I know how to listen. I know how to wait. And I know when someone is trying to play me because I've seen teenagers try it for 3 decades. What I never expected was to need those skills in my own home, against my own son. Daniel is 44. He's the kind of man who gives a very firm handshake and looks you straight in the eye when he talks to you. And for a long time, I thought that meant something. He lives in Mississauga with his wife Claire and their teenage boy, my grandson Ethan. After Margaret died, Daniel started calling more. Driving up on weekends, offering to help with the yard, with my car, with the bills. I thought grief had softened him. I thought losing his mother had reminded him what mattered. I was wrong about that. It started with the clock. It's an antique wall clock that hung in Margaret's family for 3 generations. Solid oak case, brass face, Westminster chime every quarter hour. Her mother brought it from Scotland. When Margaret died, I moved it from the hallway into the living room so I could hear it better. It's the kind of sound that makes a quiet house feel less empty. Last November, the chime started running slow, about 4 minutes behind. I took it down to adjust the mechanism. I've done it a dozen times over the years. And when I opened the back panel, something caught my eye. There was a small black piece of plastic tucked into the upper corner of the case, behind the pendulum shaft. It wasn't part of the clock. I've opened that clock 100 times. I knew every piece inside it. I stood there in my living room holding that clock, and I felt the floor shift under me. I set the clock back on the wall. I did not touch the device. I did not call anyone. I put the back panel on, wound the mechanism, and sat down in my armchair and stared at the window for a very long time. My first thought was that I was wrong, that it was something Margaret had put there, or something I'd forgotten about. But I'd never seen it before in my life. My second thought was that I needed to be absolutely certain before I did anything at all. Because if I was right about what I was looking at, then I needed to think very carefully about my next move. My neighbor across the street is a man named George, 70 years old, retired from a career in telecommunications. He's spent 35 years working with signal equipment for a major carrier. If anyone would know what I was looking at, it was George. I walked over the next morning as casually as I could and told him I'd found something odd in the clock, and would he take a look? He followed me back, opened the panel, and went very still. He said it was a small audio transmitter, a listening device. Consumer grade, he said, but not cheap. Battery-powered, capable of transmitting to a receiver within a few hundred meters, or uploading to a cloud account if configured with Wi-Fi. He said whoever placed it could hear everything said in my living room. I asked him how long it might have been there. He said there was no way to tell for certain. Months, possibly. I thanked him and asked him to keep this between us for now. He looked at me for a moment and then nodded. He understood, I think, that I already had something in mind. I put the panel back and went to make tea. For 3 days, I went about my life as though nothing had changed. I watched the news in the evening. I made my phone calls in the kitchen. I spoke out loud in the living room only about ordinary things, the weather, a recipe I was trying, the hockey scores. I did not call my son. I did not mention the device to a single person except George. I kept my voice completely normal and my face completely blank. And I lay awake at night, going through every conversation Daniel and I had in that living room over the past year. I thought about the afternoon in September when he had sat in the chair across from me and asked, very gently, whether I had thought about the house, whether I had updated my will since Margaret's passing. I told him I had a lawyer handling everything and that it was all in order. He nodded and smiled and said he just wanted to make sure I was protected. I thought about the Sunday in October when he brought Ethan up and the 3 of us watched a football game together. And afterward, Daniel stayed behind, while Ethan went to the car, and he mentioned that his friend's father had recently moved into a memory care facility in Barrie, and that it had really been the right decision for the whole family. That the father was so much happier now that he wasn't trying to manage everything alone. I said that sounded very sad. He said sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do. I thought about how he had, over the course of several visits, asked whether I was keeping up with my RRSP statements, whether I had thought about simplifying my accounts, whether I'd considered giving him power of attorney just for practical purposes, just to make things easier if anything ever happened. I had not given him power of attorney, but I began to wonder what else I might have missed. I called my lawyer on the fourth day, not from the living room, from my car, parked 2 blocks away. Her name is Patricia, and I have trusted her since she helped Margaret and me buy the house in 1993. I told her I needed to review everything: my will, any documents with Daniel's name on them, anything she might have received on my behalf. She said she hadn't received anything unusual, but she would pull everything, and we would meet the next morning. When I sat down across from Patricia the following day, I learned 2 things. The first was that my original will was intact and had not been altered. The house, my pension, my RRSP, and my savings, which amounted to just over $480,000 between the investment accounts and the registered funds, were designated exactly as I had left them, split between a charitable trust Margaret and I had established, and a portion for Daniel held in conditions I had set out clearly. The second thing I learned was that someone had contacted Patricia's office 3 months earlier, identifying themselves as calling on my behalf, inquiring about the process for establishing power of attorney, and what documentation would be required to challenge a parent's testamentary capacity. Patricia had not acted on the call because she had not been able to verify my authorization. She had flagged it and meant to raise it with me at my next scheduled appointment. My next scheduled appointment was in February. I sat in Patricia's office and kept my hands very still on the table and told her that the call had not come from me or from anyone I had authorized. I told her about the device in the clock. I told her everything I had been thinking over the previous 4 days. She picked up her phone and called a colleague in estate litigation. Then she called a contact at the Ontario Provincial Police. I drove home and made dinner and watched the evening news. When Daniel called that night, he called. Every Thursday I answered on the second ring and told him I'd had a quiet week. I mentioned that I was thinking of getting the Evistros cleaned before the snow came. He said he could come up and help with that. I said that would be nice. I want to tell you exactly what happened the following Sunday, because it was the moment I understood the full shape of what my son had been planning. Daniel arrived around noon. Ethan stayed in Mississauga that week, hockey tryouts. It was just Daniel and me, which I had expected. He brought lunch from a deli in town, which he often did, and we sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked about nothing consequential. The weather, the Leafs, a road closure on the highway. After lunch, we moved to the living room. He settled into the armchair across from me, and I asked about his work, and he talked for a while about a project he was managing. And then there was a pause in the conversation, the kind that happens naturally, and he looked at me with an expression I had seen before practiced, gentle, slightly sorrowful, and he said, "Dad, have you had a chance to think about what we talked about with Dr. Holloway?" I looked at him. Dr. Holloway is a geriatric specialist whose name I had seen on a brochure that appeared in my mailbox sometime in October. I had not spoken to Dr. Holloway. I had not made an appointment with Dr. Holloway. I had not mentioned Dr. Holloway to Daniel. I had not mentioned the brochure to anyone. There was no way my son could have known I had seen that name unless he had been listening. I held his gaze for a moment. I kept my face the way I used to keep it during a debate round, when I could see a student walking into a trap of their own making. Completely neutral, attentive. I said, "Remind me what we said." He shifted slightly. He said he thought we had discussed the idea of getting a baseline cognitive assessment, just to have on file, so that there was a record if anything ever came up. For my protection, he said, so that no one could ever question my decisions. I said I didn't remember that conversation. He said we'd talked about it in the living room. A few weeks back, he said I'd seemed open to it. I said, "Daniel, I have never mentioned Dr. Holloway to you. Not in the living room. Not anywhere." He was quiet for a moment that lasted too long. I said, "I found the device in the clock." The color left his face, I watched it go. I told him I had found it 5 days ago. I told him I had spoken with Patricia. I told him I was aware of the call made to her office. I told him that the Ontario Provincial Police had been briefed, and that there was an ongoing inquiry, and that I had documentation of everything. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he said he could explain. Then he said he had been worried about me. Then he said he just wanted to make sure I was safe. The story changed 3 times in 5 minutes. I let him talk. I had nothing to prove anymore. The proof was already elsewhere. He left shortly after. He did not take the deli containers from the kitchen table. I watched his car back out of the driveway, and I sat in my living room and listened to the Westminster chime come around, and I felt something I still struggle to name. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief. It was closer to the feeling you get at the end of a very long trip when you finally stop moving and realize how tired you are. The investigation that followed took several months. I won't walk through all of it, because some of it is still before the courts, and Patricia has been clear with me about what I should say publicly. What I can tell you is that the device in the clock was traced, that there was a plan documented in emails that his wife Claire ultimately disclosed after she retained her own lawyer to build a case for a capacity assessment that would have given Daniel effective control over my financial decisions. The house in Peterborough, the pension, the $480,000 in registered accounts. A plan years in the making, accelerated after Margaret died. I can also tell you that the call to Patricia's office was not the only one. There had been an inquiry to my financial institution as well, again on my supposed behalf, regarding the process for adding a joint account holder. The institution had flagged it and not acted. I did not know about that call until the investigation uncovered it. Claire has cooperated fully. She told investigators that the plan had been Daniel's, that she had been opposed to it from the beginning, and that she had stayed quiet out of a combination of loyalty and fear. I have no way of knowing how much of that is true. I have chosen to believe it, not for Daniel's sake, but for Ethan's. Ethan is 16. He came to see me on his own in January, took the bus up from Mississauga, stood at my door in a winter jacket that was too thin for February in Peterborough, and asked if he could come in. We sat at the kitchen table, and he said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known what his father was doing, and that he wished he had known sooner so he could have told me. He looked so much like Margaret when he cried. Same shape to his eyes. I told him none of this was his to carry. I meant it. I've seen Ethan 6 times since then. He drives now, has his G2. He comes up on some weekends, and we watch hockey, and I cook, and he tells me about school. He wants to study engineering. I told him to consider a history elective at least once. He said he would think about it. Margaret would have liked him very much. I've made changes since all of this. Patricia has put documents in place that require independent legal confirmation for any changes to my estate or financial accounts. I have a designated trusted contact on file with my bank, my friend Beverly, who I have known for 40 years and who I trust without question. I have the clock professionally examined and the device removed. It hangs in the hallway again, where it was when Margaret was alive, and I hear it chime every 15 minutes, and I think of her mother carrying it from Scotland, and I think of the 44 years it kept time for us in this house. There are things I've had to make peace with that I didn't expect. I grieved Daniel before this happened. I want to be honest about that. The son I believed I had, the father-son relationship I thought we were building after Margaret died, that was already a loss even before I found the device. Finding it just meant I had to stop pretending. I've learned there is something almost merciful about clarity, even when it costs you. I'm telling this story because I know I am not the only one. I've heard from people, since this became known in my community, colleagues, neighbors, the parents of former students, people who have felt the same slow strangeness, the same quiet alarm, and the same instinct that something was wrong, and the same reluctance to trust that instinct. We are told at a certain age that we need looking after. We are told our judgment may not be what it was. We are handed brochures and offered assessments and asked, always very gently, whether we have thought about simplifying things. I want to say this plainly. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Check your accounts. Review your legal documents with a lawyer you chose yourself, not one someone else recommended. Know what a power of attorney means before you sign one. Talk to a trusted friend, not a family member, before you make any major financial decision. I am 72 years old. I managed my own classroom for 32 years. I remember every student who ever sat across from me in a debate round. I drive myself to every appointment, cook every meal, read the paper every morning, and balance my own accounts to the dollar. I am doing just fine. The maple tree Margaret planted is going into its 32nd winter. Come spring, it will put out leaves the same as it always has. Some things that have been through a great deal manage to keep going anyway. I find I still believe that. If you're watching this and you're somewhere in your 60s or 70s, and there is something at the edge of your awareness that doesn't sit right, a question that doesn't add up, a conversation that felt slightly rehearsed, a form that appeared from nowhere, please don't wait. You are not being paranoid. You have earned the right to protect what you've built. The clock is still running. So am I. Thank you for being here tonight. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I'd really ask you to share it not for me, but for someone in your life who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It means more than you know.